To understand just how tragic and utterly unforgivable the events of October the 17th, 2024 was, we need to look at the two houses across from each other on a regular street in Circleville. In one lived Joe and Stanley Echelbarger. This delightful retired couple moved to Circleville decades ago. The whole neighborhood knew them, loved them, and were devastated when Mr. Echelbarger was diagnosed with Parkinson's and dementia. Even though they could afford to move to an upscale care facility, Joe insisted that her Stanley remain inside the familiar home for as long as they could. For 3 hours every morning, a caregiver arrived to help with bath and medication times. But other than that, Joe kept the house, and her ailing husband cared for all by herself. At 73, this absolute gem of a woman could still run circles around men and women half her age. Every other day, someone on the street stopped by to chat, to have tea, or to bring garden produce that they claimed they had no space for in the fridge. Anything to find an excuse to check that everything was all right without hurting Joe's pride. In short, the Echelbargers were cherished by their neighbors. The Withers family was a whole other story. Susan Withers, age 62, and her son Adam, 35, lived across from Joe. The Withers avoided their neighbors and they never greeted anyone. The only time they were ever seen was when they went out to walk their two Pitbulls, Echo and Apollo. Those canines were the reason that everyone feared that house. Children ran screaming from the dogs when they came down the sidewalk with them, and others crossed the road to get as far away from the creatures as a street would allow. And this was not because the neighbors were unfair toward the breed at all. Apollo and Echo had proven time and time again that they were vicious and bloodthirsty. On the rare occasions that they were out, they'd strain and pull at their leashes, the drool flying from their mouths as they barked, growled, and desperately fought to get loose to attack anyone and anything that moved. Once, Apollo saw a man walking his dog through the living room window and slammed his body against it so hard to get at the dog that the window shattered to pieces. Luckily, Adam was able to restrain the dog before it got out of the house by dragging Apollo back inside by his hind legs, since Apollo was already halfway out the window. Another time, Susan was out walking Echo. They passed a woman and her 12-week-old beagle puppy, and Echo ripped loose from his owner, throwing herself onto the poor puppy. The puppy died, and Susan barely got a hold of Echo in time before she attacked the hysterical woman too. Police were called about the incident. Unfortunately, there were no serious repercussions for this event. The day all of the warning signs finally came to a head was on October 17th. Joe had just bade goodbye to the caregiver, and Stanley had dozed off in his favorite chair, so Joe took the opportunity to tend to her garden. Across the street, Adam Withers had opened the front door, leaving the much flimsier screen door latched. The moment Joe set her tools and compost bags down in the rose bed, the dogs were at the newly installed sitting room window, barking so hysterically that the window was soon splattered with spit. Joe ignored them. This wasn't new at all. The manic snarls and barks greeted her every time she set foot out of her front door. But at least they were trapped behind a reinforced window, so it was best that she continued about her business while they tired themselves out. Only 4 minutes into her work, her back turned to the frenzied yowls. The pair discovered the open front door. They'd worked themselves into such a crazed state at the woman across the street that they charged at the door, blasting it off its hinges, sending splinters flying everywhere. When the door hit the porch, they were already halfway across the street, streaking toward Joe like murderous lightning bolts. Joe heard the door explode, whipped her head around, and saw the canines, teeth bared, sprinting straight at her. Joe managed a terrified scream and held her hands in front of her face, her trowel still in her hand, before they were on top of her. Apollo slammed into her so hard that Joe's frail body went flying several feet backward. His teeth were already impaled into her hand, holding the trowel. He shook her once, ripping her arm away from her face, and then Echo struck, sinking her teeth into the side of Joe's head. Joe screamed as loud as her lungs could muster when her ear and part of her scalp was ripped off, alerting several people nearby. When the first man arrived, Adam had finally realized what was happening and was running out of his house, still dressed in his boxers, his mother close behind him. But whatever the people streaming toward Joe were expecting, it was nothing compared to the terrible scene they came upon. The dogs were whipping and thrashing their heads, one now latched on Joe's shoulder and the other on her leg, pulling her from both ends. And Joe was fighting as best she could, hitting Echo with her hand, the bent-up trowel still between shattered fingers. Adam and Susan Withers stood there with their mouths hanging agape, completely dumbfounded. But 3 men and 1 brave woman rushed toward the bundle of flailing limbs, while a 5th woman called the police. Echo was grabbed up first, put in a headlock by an ex-policeman. She let go, but the man lost control of her almost immediately, barely keeping her at bay by storming at her with his arms held wide every time she tried to charge back into the fray. 2 men pulled Apollo off Joe, but it only resulted in the dog's teeth tearing an entire chunk out of her shoulder. Blood went spurting out of her, and the animal would have thrown himself right back if the 3 people hadn't started kicking him. When the first patrol car arrived, Joe was lying on the lawn, a flap of her scalp over what was left of her face. Her left shoulder, leg, chest, and neck were completely ruined, and she was covered in so much blood that her gray hair and blue dress was completely red. All 5 civilians were still in a deadly standoff with the dogs. Every time the pair tried to attack, they were met with kicks, a shovel, and a hosepipe that they'd managed to arm themselves with, while the Withers screamed uselessly from the street for his dogs to back down. The officers called the people back and opened fire. Both dogs were shot once, each taking the hit in their sides. If you think that would be enough to down them, then you'd be dead wrong. Apollo got up and charged like a maniac straight towards the guns. He was hit twice more, right in the chest, as he launched himself at the officer. Echo, meanwhile, took the distraction and ran off, with a bullet wound in her body. 15 minutes later, she came upon a woman and her dog, 4 blocks away, and ripped the Labrador's throat out. They were just yards away from a middle school. Luckily, the woman managed to run for her life while the beast was occupied with tearing her lab to shreds. Echo, dragging the Labrador that was now dead, tried to limp home. She reached the street where police cars were now lined up and walked right into several armed policemen waiting for her. It took only 1 more round for Echo to fall dead. The remains of the limp Labrador still clutched in her blood-stained muzzle, and by that time Joe had already breathed her last. The ambulance arrived, loaded her onto a stretcher, and then her heart just gave out. That amount of adrenaline, the incomprehensible pain and massive loss of blood, Joe's heart just couldn't take it anymore. The only good things to come out of this horrendous affair was that when Stanley woke up, he was no longer lucid. He didn't realize that his wife was killed in the most brutal way possible, and he hasn't had a clear day since Joe wasn't there to bring back his memories with her familiar face anymore. Adam and Susan Withers were sentenced to 14 years behind bars apiece. All in all, their deplorable negligence and complete disregard for others' safety has led to the deaths of 3 dogs and 1 dear, sweet old woman who only ever wanted her rose bushes to bloom for her husband one more time. This is what happens when untrained, neglected dogs descend upon innocent people. And it's always the most innocent, those who should be protected, that suffer at the jaws of nature's final affliction.